All right. Hi, everyone. We'll wait for another minute or two for the session to begin as people start filtering in, and we'll begin very shortly. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. On behalf of the Global Interagency Security Forum, GISF, we're happy to welcome you to the session that's entitled Security Risk Management as a Strategic Enabler for Humanitarian Organizations. A bit of a mouthful, but a very important topic indeed. And we have some special guests with us here today who will discuss about this issue, both from their professional and personal experiences as security specialists, but also within the lens of, or through the lens rather, of a new policy and guide that we created called Security Risk Management Strategy and Policy Development, a cross-functional guide. And this session will act as a sort of launch event for that guide as well. So we're hoping to have a nice and engaging conversation. It will have as I mentioned, a presentation. We'll highlight some examples. There will be some guest speakers speaking on their behalf about their personal experiences. And then we'll have an open conversation at the tail end. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions and discuss any of the points that were raised throughout the conversation. We're setting aside about an hour or so for this conversation, but we've allocated some buffer time in case that's needed. To introduce myself, my name is Dimitri Kotsiras. I'm the Research and Programs Manager at GISF, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. As this is an open session beyond our members, I also wanted to use the opportunity to introduce GISF. But before that, I'd like to just go through a couple of housekeeping rules, if that's all right. You're muted as participants upon arrival, but you can use the chat facility to introduce yourselves, and we very much encourage you to do so. You can add your name, your organization, your location, and just try to make sure to address it to everyone. There'll be time, as I mentioned, for questions after the presentation, and there's a Q&A function that you can use to ask any questions. If you have any issues with that, please feel free to highlight it in any capacity to my colleagues, Charlotte and Ariel, on this call, and they'll be able to troubleshoot that as quickly as possible. Naturally, there's Chatham House rules that applies throughout this event. It is being recorded, and at the tail end, we will be sending out a poll for you to complete and let us know how you thought the session went. So yeah, next slide, thank you. For those who don't know us, GISF is a independent NGO peer support network. We've been established since 2006, and we have nearly 140 international organizations that operate across the humanitarian, development, and peace space. And we focus primarily on security risk management and the safety of aid workers. Next slide. We conduct research events, and we produce research and guidance on this issue. We host other events and forums for our members. We also do some training sometimes. And we're a convener among security specialists in this space, and we act as a network to kind of bridge the gaps in best practice around security risk management. And so we're generally a repository of all things SRM. Basically, if I could just switch to the next slide, I will present our speakers. Thank you. So we have 4 guest speakers here today. The first 2 will present on behalf of GISF on the guide that I had mentioned at the start. And they're representatives from International Location Safety, ILS, which is a security risk management training company based in the United Kingdom. You have Beth Chapman, who is a senior consultant at ILS. She has over 15 years experience in operational delivery and management of overseas safety and security. She's also the director, was the director, of programs at ILS, and has worked with many organizations across this nexus to deliver safe programming in complex environments. And she's also had a specific role in supporting organizations to develop and implement strategy and operational security risk management projects. She happens to be the lead author of this guide, and she will lead the conversation around some of the key takeaways from that guide. Her colleague, Stephen Glunning, is joining as well, and he is the Director of Risk Advisory Services at ILS. He also has an extensive background in security risk management, as well as crisis management and operations management, with 23 years of experience working at the UN, first at an operational level, before jumping to more senior positions for over a decade at the World Food Programme in many countries. We have two additional guest speakers representing their own organizations. First, you have Neil Elliott, who's the Global Head of Security at Oxfam. And he has over 30 years experience in the humanitarian aid sector. He's previously worked as a country director and team leader in countless emergency responses in both conflict and natural disaster situations. And he's also been a country and regional security manager at Goal and Save the Children before his prolific career at Oxfam. And lastly, we have Shannon Fariel Muretti, who's the Director of Global Safety and Security at Child Fund. And she's joining us from the United States. She served as the Senior Director of Global Safety and Security. I mentioned this already. And she has extensive experience, in building global security and crisis management programs from the ground up, and trained numerous organizations around the issue of security risk management and crisis management. She also happens to be a board member of the U.S. State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, and is part of several steering committees around business continuity, crisis management, and SRM, including your very own GISF organization here. So I'd like to just mention a couple of things to frame the session before passing it on to Beth and Stephen for their presentation. So as I mentioned, this is tied to our newly published guide. And this was a GISF guide that was developed in collaboration with ILS. For those unaware of the guide, it's a high-level strategic guide that positions SRM as an organizational risk and tries to offer comprehensive guidance on how to address the cross-functional issues that are tied to security and security risk management, and try to leverage them as opportunities to support broader organizational strategies. So it's to help equip leaders with the tools that they need to strategically present challenges of security risk management and impact, and how those can impact an organization as a whole, and just try to find effective and appropriate cross-functional solutions across an organization's different functions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Beth and Stephen to delve a little further into that guide. Apologies, Charlotte, if you can just go to the previous slide, that'd be great. And then I'll chime in as and when needed. So please, Beth, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. Welcome everyone to the webinar as well. It's great to have you all here. And we're really hoping today's session is going to be an opportunity to also share some thoughts and some experiences as well. It's fantastic to be joined by Neil and Shannon on the call as our guest speakers. So we're really hoping today's session will be a great opportunity to be sharing some good practice as well. Things are constantly evolving in the sector, and when we started working with GISF to develop this resource, it was a really, really fascinating process to go through speaking one-on-one to senior professionals within this sector, but also looking a little bit outside of the sector as well. And I think, as Dimitri mentioned, one of the big things that came across was how important it is to understand that SRM really is so cross-cutting, and it shouldn't just be put into its little department or its little kind of section of an organization. It really has such a broad scope, and that was really what we heard from people that we were speaking to, was SRM is so important to an organization, and people really wanting to get that across so that at a strategic level that's really understood and it's being bought into by strategic leads. So that's something we really wanted to get across, through this resource. And hopefully for those of you that looked at it, the guidance and the tools we provided have started to put a pathway together for that. It was really important to us as well to showcase some of the good practice that was happening, and to put some kind of practical guidance. But as Dimitri says, this isn't a procedural guide. It's really to give you a taster and a flavour for some of the things that are happening in the sector, and to enable you to dip in and out, hopefully, to pull out bits that will be useful for you, depending on what stage your organisation is at. Next slide, please. I do love doing my Chris Whitty. So, as you can see, this is John, Executive Director of the GISF, who I'm sure you're all aware of. So as I mentioned, this resource is not specific to security specialists. We deliberately wanted to draft it and to put it across as a resource that someone working within finance or programs, operations, HR, that there are specific sections within this resource which speak to them, which are written hopefully in a language that makes sense, that they can then begin to understand and see the linkages and see the importance and see security risk management very much as something that will enable what they're trying to do within their functions. And getting that buy-in at a senior strategic level is so, so critical. So this is what we were trying to do, and this is how we're hoping the guide does come across. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, and we'll keep coming back to this, but one of the kind of key themes that came out from many of the interviewees that we spoke to and across the workshops that we ran as well was how cross-cutting SRM is. So yes, there are all these different departments, but actually SRM has this place to pull those functions together. Doesn't mean that SRM is leading, but it does mean that it actually provides a really fantastic link between each of these functions. The other core thing that to get across was that sometimes SRM can be seen almost as the final piece in a process. Strategies, planning can happen, and then SRM is brought in at the end to sort of then do the checkbox, or okay, here are our plans, now make this possible from a safety and security perspective. And what we're trying to advocate for in this resource is actually SRM should be included within the planning stage, within that strategic development that an organization goes through, because SRM really does affect each single one of those organizational functions and ensures that the organization has good resilience and also is providing a good duty of care to everyone that either works for or represents or is in partnership within that organization. So what we've tried to do is pull out, well, you know, when someone says to you in HR, well, why does that affect me? Why do I need to know about security risk management? Like, really, why does it matter to me? We've tried to really break it down in this guide to show that security risk management protects personnel. It protects data, intellectual property. It reduces your legal and financial exposure if you have a good SRM strategy and approach. It provides assurance to donors and to funders that you have stable, well-managed programs, increasing hopefully the chance of reinvestment. It increases productivity by having a nice structured and good environment, safe environment for staff and consultants and volunteers to work in. It enables you to access communities in a sustainable way. And particularly, yes, high-risk locations, but also just general access as well for programs and for operations. So this is what we're trying to show, is that SRM really does impact and can help support and enable every function of an organization. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the structure of the resource, you can see that there are 6 chapters for those of you that have looked at the resource already. Just to give you a very high-level overview about what each of those chapters contains. The first chapter is very much written as an introduction. Yeah, how do you approach strategic development? So within this chapter, there is a section around systems change, which some of you may be involved in, some of you may know a lot about. For others, that might be a new terminology, a new approach, but looking at how can you engage a whole organization in SRM? So how do you put together an effective strategy? Making sure that it isn't just a top-down approach, that it is looking at your organization, the context. So what's happening in the areas where you're working, but also what's happening internally within your organization that needs to be factored into your strategic approach around SRM. It also includes elements around how do you approach SRM looking at that bigger picture. So looking at whole organizational approach to SRM. Considering also your organization's risk appetites, its tolerance, its thresholds. So where are its red lines? So again, we start to touch on looking at those elements when you're putting that strategy together. And also how critical it is that SRM really needs to be involved, like I said, right at the beginning, in those planning and preparing kind of phases, not just once a programming operational strategy has been decided. The second chapter looks at governance. So this really starts to dig into a bit of some good practice and some kind of progressive ways around how we can embed SRM within whole organizational governance. We do keep coming back throughout the resource to saying how important it is to get senior level buy-in, and not just buy-in, like really engaging senior level staff, but also filtering it through the organization. So this chapter starts to look at what are the structures available. And there is no one size fits all structure. It's very much, here are some examples, here are some things to consider, and it will very much depend on your organization, how it's currently structured, what's already in place, roles, responsibilities, how will they sit, okay? It also starts to touch on the fact that, you know, the people that work within an organization also have a responsibility to be involved with SRM. It's not something that's just there for the strategic leads to set. And also from a strategic perspective, though, what is the organizational responsibility? So what duty of care do they provide? The third sector is probably our chunkiest chapter, and this is where we really drill a bit deeper into each of those different functions that I mentioned. So program operations, finance, communications, IT, HR, legal, safeguarding, travel risk management. And each of those different functions have its own separate section, okay? Showing how SRM is important, how they can work together, and how to approach and work with each of those different departments. So this is very much designed for someone from a finance or an IT team can come in and pick up that section and read it, and hopefully it will make sense and will appeal to them. Fourth chapter looks at strategic coordination and collaboration. So we start to touch on, well, from a strategic perspective, how do we work, not just like interagency, but also within our organizations? How are we communicating our strategy? How are we making sure that there are good synergies across functions, both internally, but also external relationships? And we do start to look at a strategic approach to partnerships as well, something that's been growing in momentum over the last few years, particularly since COVID. How do we work with different partners? What's our organizational strategy to that? Are we transferring risk? Are we sharing risk? What's our approach? And it's really important that that sits at a strategic level as well. The fifth chapter starts to look around how SRM pulls into organizational resilience, or business continuity. You might sometimes have these discussions. And again, showing SRM's role within that as well. And the final chapter looks at monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, or MEAL, as I'm sure a lot of you know this as. This is something that was relatively new kind of section for us to review and look at. And it was a really interesting piece to dive into and to see how are different organizations monitoring, evaluating the impact of their SRM strategies. And it's something we're going to hopefully touch on with our speakers as well in time. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, before we start to look at a couple of examples, some of the kind of things to pull out, some of the key highlights, I suppose, of this resource. The first one speaks about, as I mentioned, about systems change. Okay, there is a methodology that we've popped in there, which is based on something called System Craft, which is available online. It's a free resource, but we've also put it into this policy resource as a useful tool. And this very much speaks to, well, how do we go about creating effective organizational change when we're looking to put a good SRM strategy in place? And the methodology looks at key things like focusing on collaboration. So not just seeing SRM as being siloed or being seen as a very technical skill, that only those working in that sector can understand, but about linking it to the bigger picture, to the wider kind of organizational resilience, duty of care piece, business continuity. Setting a clear direction, so being really clear when you're putting your strategy in place. Well, where are you aiming for? And also having some mid-steps on the way. It's never helpful to have a big, huge goal to work for and not having it broken down into little segments. So having a direction, but breaking it down. Making it matter. And when we say that, we mean making it matter to the people that are being asked to be involved in it. So using language that people understand and taking into account what are the needs of other functions, other departments? How are we going to work together to achieve that? Rather than it just being presented as, well, we need this for our SRM strategy, but working together, making it matter to other people. So changing the incentives, that speaks about really figuring out what systems do you already have in place, what works well, and then how can we maybe use those or slightly change them to get people more engaged with our strategic objectives. So what can we already use to tweak or change? How can we simplify and make this more accessible maybe? So for example, something as simple as providing access to technology on people's phones so they can very easily report in not just incidents, but concerns or updates. Something as simple as that, using a system but making it easier for people. And harnessing collective intelligence is the other core part of this methodology, which again speaks about listening to people without the organization, not just determining something up here at top level, but really getting that understanding and hearing what people are saying who are actually there every day and see what's happening and need clear, simple strategies. Essentially, they need to understand how this is going to impact on their day-to-day work. So other things, as I mentioned, the cross-functionality, I won't go into that anymore. I think I've explained what's in the resource about that. Simplifying your language so it becomes much more easier to translate and to embed throughout the organization. So it becomes less of a technical mystery. It becomes much more of a practical enabling tool. And as I mentioned, bottom-up approach to developing strategies. Let's listen first before we decide what we're going to do for our strategy. And then this new kind of sector, maybe not too new, let's hear from the speakers, but looking at how do we pull in tools and approaches that are already being used by a lot of MEAL practitioners into this kind of SRM sector as well. So those are the kind of key highlights and a bit about the guide itself. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to do, myself and Steve, are just going to take you through a few examples. And these are examples that we've come across throughout our time, either working in the sector or through the consultancy work that we're engaged in at the moment through ILS, that we wanted to share with you, really. So just some key examples of some good practice that we've seen. And then we'd love to hand over to Neil and Shannon, who are also going to talk through some of the practice and effective ways they've approached SRM strategy within their organizations. So I'll hand over to Steve for this first example.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us here today. For this example, I wanted to go back first off to, and some of you may remember, to, I don't know if Neil would be there, the early 1990s. And why am I going there? Okay, because there were a certain number of significant humanitarian challenges going on in the 90s. I'm talking about Somalia, Rwanda, South Sudan, and then in 99, Kosovo. some of us were at all of those different events. And what was clear was the security environment was such that the only way to support staff in those areas was actually to talk to people. There wasn't necessarily a formal SRM structure. There certainly weren't SRA matrices or anything like that. It was actually getting the team together, talking through the challenges and trying to find out ways of resolving and how to deliver the program. Then we talk about watershed moments, which was for the UN was Canal Hotel in 2003, and that's now the Humanitarian Day. But I think there's been more watershed moments for INGOs than just the Canal Hotel. But what that meant was that all of a sudden, SRM, security risk management or managing security, moved away, unfortunately, from conversation to trying to make it as objective as possible. And we started developing the security risk assessment matrices, and we started putting in numbers and figures to assign to risk, which was a good thing in some ways, because it started giving us models in which to work from. But unfortunately, we started to become very, very technical from a security perspective, and people did not get involved in it. It became the ownership was on the security department. Perhaps, I'll be controversial, perhaps we shot ourselves in the foot because of that. Where this document comes in and what has happened with over the last 20 years is that we've now realized that we need to go back to basics, back to people, back to context, back to culture, and start talking to one another. So after, in 2009, we had ISO 31000, which was the enterprise risk management, but it incorporated the whole risk management process and standardized it. And what more and more organizations are now beginning to do is embed security risk management into the ERM process. And by doing this, security safety is now becoming an integral part or integral to the functional parts of an organization, to the functional parts of ERM, and it becomes part of an agenda. It becomes part of the agenda for those meetings. So with ILS, we now work with a number of organizations that have started this process, and it has become clear that as they become more engaged, as they take ownership and responsibility, they begin to realize how security and safety affects the operations and response. So the functions themselves actually see how they have an impact on, obviously, on operations and response, but how security also has an impact on operations and response. And so what it is now, organizations now tend to, or these organizations that have started including that in their ERM process, it has become part of their daily operations, to the point where some organizations now, even at the planning stage, are beginning to invite security and safety into the planning stage. And certainly at the kickoff stage. So when an organization gets the funding for a particular program to go ahead, they invite all of the key components, and one of those functions now that is invited to the table is security. And they found that things have begun to improve vastly. Budgets become available, people start talking about security, and information starts to flow, and they find the whole protection process and support process has become better. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Back to Beth.
So here is another example, and this one really talks about quite a few of the bits that we've covered, I think, already, about making sure that that the SRM is really part of that kind of feedback review mechanism, that things are feeding into it. So when programs are being reviewed, as Steve says, this is then, okay, this is a discussion, because by being aware of some of these issues, these SRM, kind of issues that come up, when we're looking at our next year or 2 or 3 or 5 of strategic planning, we need to be listening to what's happening on the ground. And we need to be hearing back from the staff that are trying to operationalize our strategy. But to do that, the language has got to be used and the engagement has got to be there. So I think one of the biggest things that I've come across is trying to move away from seeing SRM purely as like just compliance, that there has to be a sort of shift in culture to make people feel actually SRM and, the organizational approach to SRM is something that's going to help empower them, to enable them. It's not just a tick box. It is something that is there to support them. But to do that, we have to make sure our strategies are realistic, that they are contextually appropriate. And again, we heard this many times from the people we spoke to when we were doing the research for this resource, that your strategy doesn't, it needs to be considerate of the different regions you're working in, what the context is there. There doesn't necessarily, yes, you have your overarching strategy, but then what are you going to do? Because actually that one size fits all maybe needs a little bit of tweaking and changing depending on that context. It needs to be culturally appropriate so that it becomes much more intuitive, that it becomes much easier from an operational perspective to put those things into practice. So it doesn't feel like it's something that doesn't quite fit for what operationally people are trying to achieve and are doing on a day-to-day basis. Tapping into technology was another kind of key thing. And also, as I said, keep coming back to that language, not only simplifying the language, but also making sure it isn't too complex or technical when you're having to potentially translate, when you're working, as many organizations do, with teams that, English or your organizational language is not their first language. So how can we keep this effective and simplify it? So again, seeing, these examples here of involvement, getting that feedback, moving away from that, it purely being seen as compliance, I think was another kind of good example. Steve, I'll pass on to you to have a little kind of third one as well.
Thank you. There's obviously a lot of crossover in a lot of these examples, which I think is a good thing. But again, this really came out from people about SRM or security risk management becoming its own technical specialization. We want to try and move away from that. So the whole thing, as Beth was saying in the last example, is the simplicity, is to try and put strategies in place that people can understand, have conversations with people, get them involved in the actual process. And just one example of quite a large INGO organization, as we're working with, we're supporting them because they've just embarked on, they've recognized this challenge within their own organization. And they're working on now a huge organizational comms strategy to spread, if you like, the SRM word. It's looking at communication strategies, essentially to simplify messaging, the use of videos, visual imaging, staff webinars. And the idea is to get all staff, not just security staff or executive staff or managers, but all staff to encourage them to communicate with one another, but in particular to communicate their cultural and personal context, their concerns and their vulnerabilities. This organization has seen this as a challenge, as a gap, and they know that if they can do this, if they can get SRM talked about within the across the organisation, then things will become easier for them to support security and safety across the organisation. Thank you. Back to Beth.
Thanks. I'll just do a light touch on this one because this covers some of the things we've mentioned about this kind of cross-cutting piece around SRM. But again, some of the feedback we had when we were doing this research was, and putting this piece together, was that security risk management is quite often brought in to manage a crisis. It almost looks like this kind of the sticking plaster. Now things have gone wrong. Okay, let's bring our security risk management specialists in. And yeah, I'm not trying to say that's not important. Obviously, there is that role to play. But it's also about putting across how important SRM is as part of the planning and preparedness phase as well, and not just keeping it as a, hi, yep, you're here to fix things. It should be part of those bigger piece discussions about, well, what are we going to do to make sure our organization is resilient, and making sure that we're maintaining organizational continuity, if we don't want to use the word business, but certainly organizational continuity, organizational resilience. And as we pointed out before, SRM is a great connector between departments. So its role to play within this planning and preparedness, I think, is really, really critical. Yeah, Steve mentioned it. I've just been working with an organization that is trying to do just that, is starting to look at things initially from the SRM lens, but then actually broadening this out now to their whole organizational approach to business continuity, organizational resilience. So I think that's, we need to see that bigger picture as well. Steve, I'll hand back over to you for our last couple of examples.
Yeah, again, this is more to do with the process of risk management than necessarily the, it's to try and encourage organisations to show that the risk management, unless perhaps we should get away from calling it security risk management, but risk management cuts across the organisation. Everyone has a certain level of responsibility and accountability for certain things within their function, within the jobs that they do. And there shouldn't be a single point of failure. If you have a single point of failure, then things tend to fail, or it's always a case of pointing fingers and saying, that's your responsibility. There's always someone to pass the buck to. If you've had those conversations, if you've had within your organization, if you've had the ability to discuss the challenges, discuss the context, to talk with the people, to talk with their different functions, you can share that risk ownership across the organization. And it just makes for a more coherent and, I think, safer organization where you've got the where everyone understands their role, if you like, in the risk management of a particular organization in order to deliver their program. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And just a kind of a last one, really, before I sort of hand over to our panel, our guest speakers. Sorry, this was something that came back as well as through the resource, but also through quite a number of organisations I've worked with recently, with making sure there is that sort of difference between, or that recognition of security risk management, which includes the safety part as well. So, we always look at, yes, security, which is looking at the intentional threats, to an organisation, but not forgetting the safety perspective as well. So the unintentional threats, road incidents, health, medical, that type of thing. And so again, I've been working with an organisation recently that aren't just looking at security risk management, they're looking around safety as well, and including that health and safety aspect. And again, you start to see this kind of cross-cutting work from like HR or people operations, that where health and safety often sits, to then we need to connect this to the security piece as well, because there's a lot of similarities there too. So that's, again, just another example of where I've seen this kind of cross-functional work happening in a really successful way. Can we just go on to the final example? So this example really, I'm not going to talk through because I'm going to hand over to Neil and Shannon to talk through their experiences. So I think if we can just leave this example up on the screen and I can hand over to, I think, Shannon, would you like to go first? Because this really is kind of one of the conversations we had, and I just thought it was really brilliant to share it with other people. And Neil, I know you've got some great things to share as well. So I'd like to hand over to our guest speakers now. So Shannon, please.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, GISF and ILS for this important discussion. I love this guide. I just wanted to start by saying that. I think it has so many useful tools and links, and I've found several that are new to me. So thank you very much for all of your effort. So this example for me, I won't read the slide, but this is kind of how I've positioned SRM in Child Fund, just as an example. And even though I may refer to like executives or leadership, I do believe that this is applicable for country directors, regional directors, other leaders, and that is actually how we were positioned in Child Fund. So really in ensuring the success of SRM in our organizations to get buy-in across all departments. Beth, you've talked a lot about language, and to me, that's like one of the key things that we continually, myself, my team, SRM professionals, we continually have to like focus on. Using common language is something that is like at the top of my list to focus on in order to get that message across, to be that connection that you talk about, to be that link. If we sound too technical or too detailed, my colleagues will shut off and they won't ask questions because they don't know what kind of questions to ask. So it really has to be broken down, justified, why am I saying what I say, and actionable. And personally for me, if I don't hear back when I am doing such a communication, I'll actually personally follow up and say, hey, did you want to touch base about this? Did you want to talk about it? Because sometimes I think I'm not being technical, and I am. So that's just a personal thing that I have to do to check myself. The other thing that's really important is data, but data and storytelling as they go hand in hand. So where's the data? This is what our leaders want to see. This is what speaks their language. Where's the data? How can I prove what I'm saying? And will the data and will what I'm saying or requesting be a good business decision and a good return on investment? So that's how I position business decisions or requests. So my experience is often we as professionals will say something like, SRM will help prevent incidents and that will help protect our reputation. But that statement is just an opinion unless data or information can back it up. And so this is how leadership will look at it, in my experience. So what data will make the executives lean in or tilt their head in a meeting? And I literally mean that. Like I look for executives to do this or to do this. And it may look odd when they're all doing that. You're like, oh boy, am I talking foreign? But in my follow-up, I've learned that I've hit the heart of the message when they do that. And so those are the things that I look for because I've learned to read our leaders. Now, storytelling to me is a big part of that. I'm not a natural storyteller. I had to learn this along the way, and I continue to really try to improve my storytelling. So whenever I have a new executive, particularly a new CEO, and I've worked with 8 CEOs in 13 years, like that's a lot of CEOs, but I ask the people around them, how do they receive information when they first come into the organization? Tell me how they receive information. And I always ask, do they prefer the data first or do they prefer the story first? And I really feel like those go hand in hand. So I do my homework. And again, this doesn't have to be for a CEO. This could be for a new country director, a regional director, a program director, a business development person, whoever that person is that you're trying to influence. And I present in that way. So I do my homework and I present in that way. So, and the stories are always tied to our programs, our people, our strategic direction, and our values. So one example here just to kind of put a little handle on it, and I'm wrapping it up. One example is when I was doing incident analysis, we don't have a lot of physical assaults. You know, you're not going to see 100 physical assaults in our incident analysis. We have some, not double digits, sometimes double digits, not often double digits. So it may look like it's not really a risk. But we had an incident where somebody was assaulted because of their ethnicity. So in presenting the data, you know, I don't have to go for those high and elaborate stories. You know, I just simply said, the very diversity we celebrate was the reason why they were assaulted. Because diversity is a value of our organization, and we talk about it a lot. And so that very small number on the graph became a huge impact to the team. So that's how we can tie things together. And I just want to end with encouragement, strategy, vision, all of that. Yes, and we did a great job of covering that. But just a little encouragement. I look at security, I look at SRM in a cross-cutting function as a business resiliency strength. And to see it that way, I really have to study change leadership, because it's usually not how organizations tend to think. I find that security professionals can really be hyper-holed into the gates in the cars and in the trip assessments. And so to help unlock that hyperhole, I really focus on change leadership. And so you might have a great idea, you might have a great strategy, but it could be pitched to the wrong person or at the wrong time, or it could be the wrong message. Or let me put that positively. Pitch what you need and what you're asking to the right person at the right time with the right message. And if you get a no, look for all three of those areas of influence. You might be influencing the right person, but it might be the wrong time. They might have a higher priority that they're really focused on. Or it might be the wrong person, but the right time. So they all kind of go together, and don't give up. And we're going to do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Much appreciated that for that. And it's a very heartwarming kind of message at the tail end. I'm going to pass it on to Neil for his take on this issue, and then we can jump onto some Q&A. I realize we are going a bit above what we anticipated in terms of time, but luckily we have a bit of that buffer to eat into if we need to. So Neil, please go ahead.
Right. Well, I'll see if I can bring anything to the table on this one. I'm going to use an example of what we're going through now. And starting off with, I think Steve said, and I think Beth said it, we're starting to go away just about talking about security risk management. We're starting to look more and more at not at a more holistic, or what we're calling an integrated approach to risk. And within Oxfam, about 18 months ago, they did a big research on the attack on civic space. Why is it getting harder? And they realized at the heart of that was, how do we manage the risks of increasing attack on civic space, civil society, and we all sit in that civic space and we are part of civil society. They go, now security, safety and risk management is actually something, turns out to be a key to that whole environment we work in. It was an amazing sort of light bulb moment for people that tend to not think about security. Suddenly realized we work, the environment we work in has inherent risks to it. So out of that, we managed to get the conversation. It's not just security we need to look at. We need to look at all forms of risk. And we've already said, talking to our HR teams, our cyber teams, our legal teams, finance, media, comms, and we're now trying to look at all the risks involved with the work we do. We're very, we turn out, we're not bad at bombs, bullets, kidnaps, crime. But what on top of that is new threats or different threats coming from cyberspace, coming from attacks of legal changes to the NGO laws in lots of countries. So what we're doing now is having a much wider conversation where people have suddenly gone, now, how do we manage all these risks? And to be honest, what within the security risk management sector, document, the process we've got, like what we're looking at here. They're going, well, security's got a lot of these systems and setups in place. The language we use, the fact we do risk assessments, we risk rate countries, how do we broaden that out to include all forms of risk? And by doing that, we're now touching a lot more different people within Oxfam as a whole. I'm not going to say Oxfam as an organisation because there's actually 22 different organisations, but how do we get everyone on board to do that? And one of the things we're doing now is looking at the security policy we have. How do we update it to be fit for the environment we operate in now? And one of the things we're hoping to do is look at not only targeting the senior management and the CEOs and the likes, but actually go to our staff on the ground and say, how do you perceive your risks? What do they mean to you? And how do you think what do you need to go about doing your job? So it's going to be a two-tiered approach, probably three-tier. Grassroots approach, grassroots communications, asking people what do they know about the systems we've got in place, because quite often we've got lots of lovely documents, systems, procedures, policies in place, but are they getting to where they need to go? Do people understand them? And I think Beth has gone about and Shannon about simplifying the language is actually what information you actually need to be able to do your job, and how do we simplify that language, simplify that the policies and procedures we have to actually make them useful and accessible to the people that use them. So this is what's going on at the minute, and the approaches to security risk management, I would like to remove the word security and just talk about risk management, which would incorporate, as I said, everything, all sorts of things, including one of the things we are looking at is talking to our partnership teams. How does the risk management we do, how can we work with that with also our partners? Because that's another big conversation that's going on, not perhaps for today within this. So it is the fact that we are having a much more holistic approach to risk management is given us a much more open doors to perhaps people that weren't that interested in the word security and looking at security thinking it's done, it's siloed, it's something others will look after. Because we are now looking at a wide approach to this, is suddenly a much easier conversation because the people with much wider audience. So that's what's happening in Oxfam at the minute. I don't know how well it will work because this is a complex in nature, the risks we face, the different people's viewpoints on risk. And also the fact that we're finding is depending on your geographical location, you may have a different, you're looking at different types of risks and have a different understanding of those risks and probably potentially different ways of managing those risks, depending on where you come from and the environment you're working in. So we sit here in the center going, well, these are the risks we do, these are the risks we look at, and these are the approaches, without actually taking consideration maybe the more localized risks, and therefore do we need a more localized approach? So the bottom line is the ability to have these discussions in the wider audience, because of the way Oxfam is starting to look at civic space, the fact they realise that the risks that we're facing to civil society is increasing, the fact that there's more than just the traditional security risks, we are now having that conversation. And that's basically the way Oxfam's approaching it. And hopefully that will allow us to improve our risk management across the board.
All right. Thank you, Neil, for that very interesting case study looking into how you're approaching it from your perspective on Oxfam. And you bring about some interesting points that kind of mirror back what Stephen was saying about moving the security element, just focusing on risk management more generally, and that's a good way of communicating more broadly. So we've now finished the sort of presentation side of the conversation. As I mentioned at the start, we originally envisioned about an hour, but now we're cutting to close to that hour, so we can potentially just include some additional time as a buffer in case that's needed. Again, I'd very much welcome all of our participants to use the Q&A function to ask any questions that they may have. And, we have experts here who would be able to respond to that. But while we wait for questions to come in, are there sort of any immediate comments, Beth or Stephen, based on what Shannon and Neil said from their experience, that this is the first time you're hearing it, so you might have some interesting insights?
I think I'll chip in first. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
I think really interesting. I mean, I've speaking to Shannon before, and I was really we had a great conversation, and I think they said that whole piece around that, how do you communicate, and I really like again going back to how do you read the room. I love that thing that you said, Shannon, about when people really start nodding, or start to move their heads, it's something like, okay, this is why it matters. And I think it goes back again to that sort of that systems change bit that the resource speaks about, which is how do you get people engaged? How do you get them to see at a strategic level, why is this important? So I love that. And Neil, really interesting obviously hearing from Neil and what's going on at Oxfam, and that piece that we're really trying to get across here, that security risk management is about so much more. So really interesting to hear that you're going, that the Oxfam are looking at that. Yeah, let's move it just to risk management. We've got the tools, the techniques. Let's start applying it across the board as it should be. But great to hear that. Steve, sorry, I'll hand to you.
The only thing I would reinforce, and thank you, is the put communication front and center. And I think it's key. We go back to basics and we talk to people. We don't send out lots of matrices and have lots of technical data. We talk and get feedback from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to acknowledge just a message earlier from Matthew Brokenshire about how he appreciated this presentation, the work, and he says it will help encourage him to take it further within his own organization. And I want to flag a question by Munir Aleriani when he basically asks, what's the difference between security risk and SRM? So perhaps this is just to kind of bring in a bit of that technical lingo if we're talking about more accessible language. Does anybody want to take this on?
I mean, yeah. I can start off just with which is a really good point. And one thing that I think every organization and every sector is guilty of is using acronyms too much. So SRM, what are we talking about? Security risk management. So security risk is talking about what are the threats. For us at ILS, when we talk about security risks, we're looking at deliberate, targeted, intentional threats to an organization. Safety is unintentional threats. So that's what we're looking at when we're trying to weigh up what is the probability and the likelihood of a threat happening. That's what we talk about when we talk about security risk. SRM is what is the structure, what is the framework you have in place to manage that security risk. So that speaks about the whole framework around managing that security risk. So that's what we talk about when we're saying SRM, security risk management, as a whole approach. That's how I would summarize it. But please, if I've missed something or anyone else would like to chip in, please do go ahead.
No, thank you, Beth. I think that's pretty clear as it stands. Now, it could be that the Q&A function is a bit struggling, but I don't see any other questions. If there are any questions anybody wants to come up with, please feel free to do so now. Otherwise, we can jump to concluding comments by all of our panelists and guests. I'll take a moment just to allow people for last-minute questions while we finish up. Well, it seems that we don't have anything at this stage. So at least, everyone was listening in carefully, and we appreciate your time and attendance. So I'd like to pass it on to all panelists to just provide some closing comments on this and things to look forward to with not just this guide, but this conversation, but more broadly about engaging security risk management at a strategic and policy level. perhaps we can start with Stephen, just to kick it off.
Sorry, it took me by surprise and I couldn't find my mute button. I think we've actually talked about one of the things is what examples have you seen of well-integrated engaging SRM strategies and associated policies? I think there's a number of things out there that we could use, and I don't really want to go. I'm not sure that I would want to sort of pinpoint any particular organisation, but in order to have a well-integrated and engaging SRM strategy and policy, all I would reinforce is it's got to have executive ownership. It's got to be, if the executive management do not buy in to the process and promote the process, then you're not going to get it integrated, because they're just not going to have the time or the inclination to support it. And I'm just going to go back to Shannon's thing, and what would be your top 3 tips for an effective SRM strategy? And I would just say communication. Yeah, there's lots of things that go around it, but if you cannot communicate, then you're not going to have an effective SRM strategy. If you cannot communicate it, and that communication involves getting the buy-in of your executive management. I would suggest it's down to the risk advisor, the risk manager, the security advisor, whatever it is to actively promote and communicate SRM across the organization. And so that person has to be good at communication. Thank you.
Many thanks, Stephen. Maybe I'll pass it on to Shannon, if that's possible. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Wasn't ready for you to call on me, but I appreciate the call. And yes, absolutely. Top 3 tips: storytelling with data, and don't give up. I frequently will tell people my job is not to be a global security director. My job is actually to persuade people. And we really have to learn, coming from somebody who's not very patient, we have to learn patience and persuasion and the right time. And so really don't give up. You are an influencer, you're an organizational change maker, and that takes time and patience, and it'll be worth it in the end because of the impact to the program participants that we're able to have as a humanitarian sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I'll pass it on to Neil.
I think a lot of people summed it up. I mean, communication is the biggest one, and as Shannon says, you have to, influence it. I think the biggest thing is, when we're talking about risk management, is learning to talk to people in the language they understand. I think the security sector, I think Beth's pointed out, has its own language, its own acronyms, as the aid sector does in general, but how to talk to people in a way that they go, actually, that makes sense. So it is about communication. It's also about having a vision. It's all very well going on, and it's taken me a long time to understand how Oxfam works, where Oxfam wants to be, what its strategy is, what is it's in its DNA. How do we fit the risk management into that vision so that it fits in with the way Oxfam sees itself, wants to be in, I think, at least 10 years' time. So my job is to really understand what Oxfam wants. So I have to read all the strategic documents, the planning documents that come out, and then pitch the risk management that will be seen as helping Oxfam move and do its job.
All right, thank you, Neil. And we'll circle it back to Beth, who began the conversation. And yeah, Beth, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, I mean, just to echo what everyone else on the call has said, I mean, the big thing for me is the resources are big documents, but I think hopefully it's designed in a way, please dip in and out, have a look at it. There are some practical tools at the end. It's written to flow, but you can dip in and out of the chapters. So please, you do that. Go and pull out the bits that you would think be most helpful for you. For me, I guess the two phrases I think probably that most important is, one is make sure you harness the collective intelligence within your organization. There are people both at field programmatic level, but also the strategic leads as well. Listen to them, collect that information, go out and ask them questions, collect that information, and then back to that key phrase for me, which is make it matter. Make people see. And if you're feeling sort of alone, you're a global safety security manager and you're thinking, well, I don't know how to approach this, go and look at this resource, look at each of those sections which speaks about why SRM is important to finance, to HR. Use that to sort of start your conversations and to make it matter to those people at strategic level, but also right down to, as I said, that field programmatic level as well. Once you get people on your side for that, it makes the journey easier. So small steps, know where you're going, but yeah, make it matter. Keep coming back to that. How can I make people engaged and care about this as much as we all do?
Thank you,
also,
Beth.
to finally say as well, massive thank you to everyone. I know there are probably people on the call who are involved in this project and spoke to me and Nathan and Hannah and Stephen along the way. So just a huge, huge thank you as well for getting involved in that.
Thanks for that addition, Beth, and thanks for rounding it up. And yes, indeed, some people from the working group were involved and have participated in this call as well. Yeah, so just to wrap it up, we highly encourage you to read the guide. It's linked there, as Ariel has put on the chat box. And we hope that we can continue this kind of conversation, socialize the utility of this and what is necessary. And I think there's a fixation on communication. I think that's something that we're going to keep trying to do on our own end as well to socialize this further. I just want to acknowledge a couple of last minute comments from Francis Andrews about looking forward to reading the guide. So I'm really happy that this might have served as a primer for that individual. And then from Sam Sherman to thank you, GISF and everyone else, for the great comments, and useful to hear about policy comments, and it's food for thought for sure. So that's also great to hear. So yeah, at this point, we'll leave it as it is and close the webinar for today. But we very much encourage you to engage with us further on this, check the guide, and please feel free to reach out to Beth and Stephen at ILS here. And if anybody wants to get in touch with Neil and Shannon, happy to share that info as well upon request. So with that, I'll finish off the webinar, and thanks again for everyone's time. Appreciate it, and take care and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Take care.